Hello, and welcome to the March edition of the third Thursday at Hoover's. It's great to see so many of returning visitors again. I'm Jerry Flegel, President and CEO of the Hoover Presidential Foundation, and we're so glad that you could all visit us this evening. I'd like to encourage you to regularly check our website and Facebook page, as well as those of the library, historic site, and your favorite public library for special program offerings that'll pop up in the months ahead. In fact, we have online programs every month for you to enjoy, including some special programs hosted by members of the Hoover family. In just 2 weeks, Leslie Hoover Lobel, one of Herbert's great-granddaughters, and archivist Spencer Howard will present Lou Henry Hoover, A Life of Adventure. The program falls on March 29th, which is actually Lou's birthday. As for this program, we invite you to enter questions at any time during the program through the Q&A feature you'll find along the edge of your screen. You may also vote for questions someone has entered if you'd also like to hear those answered. As we might not have time to answer all the questions provided, top vote getters will be asked first. Today's presentation is called A Woman of Achievement, Stories from the Life of Lou Henry Hoover. As the nation's first lady, Lou worked privately to find employment opportunities for individuals and hurting communities, while at the same time raising Americans' awareness of the historical value of the White House and the importance of the arts. In her post-White House years, Lou continued to use her organizational and philanthropic skills to create new educational opportunities for students and cultural opportunities for her beloved Stanford community. Tonight, we'll learn about the achievements of a First Lady whose legacy has largely been forgotten, but whose impact is still felt today. Our speaker is Annette Dunlap. She is an independent scholar and journalist and author of the award-winning Frank, the story of Frances Folsom Cleveland, America's youngest First Lady. Charles Gate Hawes, A Life and the Gambler's Daughter. Ever since she was a schoolgirl, she has enjoyed reading about other people's lives and determined at an early age that one day, one of her books would be in the biography section of the library. Tonight, she's here to share stories from her recent research on Lou Henry Hoover. Annette, it's a pleasure to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Jerry. It's great to be with you, and thank you for the opportunity for me to share some of the things that I've learned about Lou through the great generosity of the foundation in helping me do research. So I've got a slideshow if my computer will cooperate. So what I thought I would do for us to get started is just do a very, very quick recap about Lou's life. She was born March 29th, as we've just heard, 1874. Her parents were Charles and Florence Weed Henry, and Lou was born in Waterloo, Iowa. She was raised in Waterloo in her early years, and her family went to Texas in the hope of looking for some climate that would work a little bit better for Lou's mother, who had chronic bronchitis. Then her father, Charles, had an employment opportunity in Kansas, which didn't work out. And the family finally settled in Whittier, California, and remained there. And Lou identified as a Californian for the rest of her life. She started out by attending the Los Angeles Normal School to train to be a teacher, which, by the way, was a forerunner of what is today UCLA. And then she transferred and got her teaching certificate from San Jose Normal. But she had trouble. She really was not satisfied as a teacher. As a woman, she was closed out of opportunities to have a career in banking, which was her father's profession. And so she attended a series of lectures and learned more about geology, and she became fascinated with it. She wrote to Stanford and asked if she could study geology, and Stanford was a fairly newly formed university, and they accepted her. And so she graduated with a BA in geology from Stanford University, the first woman to get that degree from that school. Stanford is where she met Herbert Clark Hoover, who probably through the balance of this presentation, you will hear me referred to as Bert, having kind of begun to refer to him that way after reading so many of Lou's letters and correspondence. The couple had two sons, Herbert Jr., who was born in 1903, and Alan in 1907. Both were born in London, where Bert worked for a mining company. Pretty much that was his base because they traveled the world. So when the couple got married, Bert had already just been promoted to a position in China, so they left the next day after their wedding and headed to China. And in 1900, where they lived, which was near Shanghai, the town was Tientsin, they were there during the siege with the Boxer Rebellion. You can see here a photograph of Lou at the battlements with a cannon. And she was one of the people who helped to walk the perimeter and to patrol the British-American compound, which is where many of the Europeans and foreigners had gathered for safety. She nursed wounded in what was the building that was used as the British Embassy, but she also had a responsibility and took responsibility for helping to distribute provisions to a lot of the civilians there and oversee their welfare and well-being. And Lou had already exhibited some pretty strong organizational skills even through high school and in her college years. But you can almost kind of mark this experience as the beginning of her strong outreach and her ability to be very effective in organizing people and in being able to see things get accomplished. And it was a skill that would stay with her throughout the entirety of her life. Just a quick little history lesson for those of us who may have forgotten about how quickly World War I got started. But in the end of May, there was the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife had been, the end of June, had been assassinated in Sarajevo. And the hostilities that started to develop between Prussia and Germany and its allies, and then Britain and France and their allies, really began to heat up across the continent. And a number of efforts were made in order to try to have peace from the assassination attempt, but it became pretty much a catalyst for other tensions that were going on during the war. So the war broke out at the very beginning of August of 1914. What that ended up doing was stranding thousands and thousands of Americans. It was in the middle of the summer. Europe was a very common area for Americans to come and take vacation. So you had stranded Americans, you had stranded Americans who were visitors, you had stranded Americans who had been employed, who had to flee Germany and France as the battle heated up. It wasn't just that there was war, it was also that all of the banks had shut down, that the ability to exchange your money into currency that would be recognized was not even available. Lou went down to the Savoy Hotel in London. She worked with an organization of which she was the vice president, the Society of American Women in London, and she organized them, and she helped to find places for people to stay. Began as once passenger travel on ships began again, and I should throw in here that one of the very favorite passenger lines, shipping lines before the start of the war was the Hamburg America line, which was a German-based liner. So everybody who had tickets on those ships suddenly had no way to get home. So she was helping to find opportunities to find berths on ships so that people could get back to the United States. She loaned money out of her own personal funds until the banks reopened. She helped to organize people to make sure they had a place to stay, food to eat, clothing, and it was quite a formidable effort. Once most of the Americans who needed to leave Europe had done so, then Lou began to work with the Society of American Women in London. And I should say that this was a fairly prestigious organization. The Duchess of Marlborough, who was an American, Consuelo Vanderbilt, and Jenny Jerome, who was Winston Churchill's mother, were also two women who were part of this organization and actually colleagues of Lou in the work that they were doing for relief in the war. So with that group, they founded a hospital to treat wounded British soldiers who were coming back from the front. But Lou also oversaw and was the treasurer for the establishment of two sewing factories that were used to employ women so that they would have an income while the men and their families were overseas. One of the interesting components of the factories was that it provided full-time childcare and a meal every day in the middle of the day to the employees. So quite forward thinking. That wasn't all that Lou did. Herbert got started with what became the Commission for the Relief of Belgium, because Belgium was invaded by Germany on the very first day of the war. The Germans did everything that they could to destroy the country. Most of Belgium's food was imported, and so because they didn't have enough agricultural land. So you had a country that had the potential to be starved, and efforts were made to begin to import wheat into Belgium and to provide foodstuffs. And so Bert, working with a group of men, organized the Commission for the Relief of Belgium. And though Lou never had a truly on the masthead official position, other than a member of the board on the women's division for the commission, she put her life in danger actually by traveling back and forth across submarine and patrolled waters from the Germans to be able to raise money for the commission in the United States. One of the other activities that she involved in was that Belgium had been famous for its high quality lace makers, and she worked with a good friend of hers, Charlotte Kellogg, to employ the women in their lace making and create opportunities for that lace to be sold, mainly to many of Lou's very well-to-do friends in the United States. That money was then funneled back into Belgium and also used to be able to buy foodstuffs for the Belgian population. Both Lou and Bert received awards from the King and Queen of Belgium at the end of the war for their heroic efforts in what they did to preserve and protect the Belgian people during the war. And if I had enough time, I would talk about some of the other things that she did, but this is a good taste of, again, her philanthropic orientation, her ability to organize, the way in which she networked with other women to get things accomplished. Just a very, very effective person. So if you signed on to the webinar before we began, then you heard a blurb about Lou's engagement with the Girl Scouts of America. So just a quick background on that organization so that you can have a good understanding of why her role was so impactful. The organization was founded in 1912 by a woman from Savannah, Georgia, who was known by as Daisy Lowe, Juliet Gordon Lowe. And Lou and Daisy had known each other in Britain because Daisy had been married to a British citizen. Daisy and her husband divorced, and then he passed away, and that left her fairly well off. She returned to the United States, although she would occasionally divide her time between Britain and the United States. But she came up with this idea of having something that would organize girls and give them a chance to be involved with a variety of activities, not just the more traditional homemaking skills, but also to enjoy being outdoors, to learn more about woodcraft and outdoor skills. And Daisy attempted to recruit Lou to help with the Washington, D.C. Council in 1916. And Lou said at that time she was too busy. But after Bert became was employed by the by Wilson's administration to become the food administrator after the United States entered World War I, when Lou was offered an opportunity, this time she accepted. And very quickly she realized that, as the little information piece had said, that she had been a Girl Scout all of her life. Her father had kind of raised her as a boy, what we would say as a boy. She learned how to ride, she shot, she hunted, She loved to be outdoors. She loved physical activity, and she believed that physical activity was just as important as mental activity, which is very much ahead of the time. We kind of know that today, but there were still attitudes that women should not be physically active, that it was not healthy for them. So Lou was very much at the forefront of changing the roles of women, and she had to kind of navigate these tensions between the more traditional attitude about women and this more progressive attitude about women. She was very, very successful with that. We might say today that she should have been a little more hardline, and indeed there were some of her women friends who were more active in the suffrage movement who thought she should have been more outspoken. But Lou was a really skillful diplomat and kind of understood almost intuitively how far she could push envelopes before it was just time to sit back and let things go along at their own pace. Lou eventually became president and then chairman of the board of the Girl Scouts. And as was mentioned, she was very, very effective as a fundraiser. She helped to reorganize the finances of the organization. She professionalized it. She saw the importance of the leadership having true training in leadership skills. She oversaw the building of several of the Girl Scout camps that are still in operation today. And it is really not an understatement to say that her influence, her dedication, her personal funding is very critical in the survival of the Girl Scouts in those early years, in becoming a very successful and wide-ranging organization, and the impact that it made on the lives of women. Lou also helped to found the National Amateur Athletic Federation, and she was the only woman on their board. And even after the men's division foundered, the women's division, a lot under Lou's leadership, continued and eventually was absorbed into another recreational organization in the early 1940s. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, again, we are talking about really changing an understanding of the role of women and the importance of physical activity with women. And the foundation as a whole came about as a result of conversations around the Hoover dinner table. Herbert Hoover did not like to eat by himself, and Lou recognized that at the end of a long day, he needed to have intellectual stimulation and people that would engage him and give him opportunities to share and to bounce ideas off of. And she organized, and they always had dinner guests, and it was what we would call a salon of very high-powered, intellectual, knowledgeable people. And it was at one of these such meals that the conversation with the U.S. Secretary of the Navy was one of the attendees at that evening. There was this discussion about how poorly conditioned the Americans had been when they were drafted into World War I. It was out of those conversations that this federation developed. So again, we see that Lou really could listen to where needs were, to insert herself in places where perhaps nobody else was willing to devote the time or the energy, but it was all for the purposes of really trying to improve the lives of young people, make them healthier, encourage them to be active and therefore more productive citizens. Lou hated publicity. And one of the conclusions that I've drawn from my time in studying about her is that in part her hatred of sharing publicity and letting people know some of the wonderful things that she was doing through the press is part of the reason why we do not know as much about her today as I wish that we did. She did, however, make the cover of Time twice. Now, Time was founded, I want to say, in 1923. Lou was the second woman to have a cover story on Time. And that was as a result of her organizing what was the National Women's Conference on Law Enforcement. So a little bit of background on that. And prohibition was in force at the time. And prohibition was not being, it may have been in force, but it wasn't really well enforced. And particularly in some states where alcohol consumption was a cultural component, a lot of law enforcement officials looked the other way. Lou was more or less a teetotaler, and she, along with other women, believed that if this was the law of the land, this was the law that needed to be enforced. And so she worked with some other women to call this conference together. All of the other current and former first ladies who were interested joined that. So Grace Coolidge, who was first lady at that time, Frances Folsom Cleveland, who was Frances Folsom Cleveland Preston, Edith Roosevelt, they all joined Lou. And bear in mind, this is before Lou was first lady, but that's the kind of influence that she had. And so the women came together and listened to speeches about the importance of enforcing the law of the land. And Lou got attention and national recognition for those efforts. The photograph in color on the right of the screen is her photograph shortly after she was moved into the White House as First Lady in 1929. And as you can see from the bullet point, she is the first Lady to have her cover photo on Time magazine. I might also add that even though she was not a cover story, she is the first Lady to have been photographed and had an article written about her in the Vogue fashion magazine. So let's take a little bit of time and talk about some of Lou's accomplishments as First Lady of the United States. So the Hoovers were in the White House from March of 1929 to March of 1933. If you know your history, you know our original inauguration date was March 4th. During the Roosevelt administration, it got moved to January 20th, which is the date we have today. One of the first challenges that Lou faced as First Lady was that an African American from the South Side of Chicago had been elected to Congress. And his name was Oscar DePriest. His wife was Jessie DePriest. Now, Washington is south of the Mason-Dixon line, and it was very heavily segregated. There had not been any Black members of Congress since the early 1890s after the passage of the Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruling, which is where we got the phraseology separate but equal. So when Oscar DePriest was elected, there was the question of whether or not his wife should be invited to any social affairs. And the overwhelming answer among a very segregationist capital city was no. And Oscar DePriest was shunned in the House of Representatives. The members of Congress who were from Southern states informed the Speaker, Nicholas Longworth, who was Alice Roosevelt Longworth's husband, that they were not going to have offices nearby a Black man, and they weren't going to sit on committees with him. So Lou was in a very interesting position about whether or not to socially acknowledge Jessie DePriest. Now, it was traditional for the First Lady to always have a large-scale congressional reception where the wives of both the senators and the members of Congress, members of the House, would come pretty much just at one time and go through a receiving line and have refreshments. Lou realized that that was not something that she was going to be able to do. So what she ended up doing was, instead of having one very large-scale reception, she organized a series of smaller, more intimate teas, where most of the events had about 50 or 60 congressional wives in attendance. And then very quietly, with people that she knew would be supportive and have no problem having tea with an African-American woman, she sent a private invitation to Jessie DePriest to have the tea on June 12th. And so on that date, Mrs. DePriest came to the White House. The other members of some cabinet wives, a couple of congressional wives who had been invited in advance came, and then all hell broke loose. Most of that summer was spent. Many of the houses, the legislative houses in the deep southern states, censured Mrs. Hoover. People that had voted for Burt because he had gotten some very strong support from southern states, which had traditionally voted for the Democratic presidential candidate. Herbert Hoover got a lot of letters expressing dismay that he would have allowed this to happen in the White House, and it caused quite a bit of a stir. But although Lou never followed up with that, it was still, for the time and the era, a relatively brave thing to do. One of the things that was mentioned on the intro before we got the program started was how involved Lou became in the renovations of the White House and in really beginning to showcase the quality of the furnishings and the inventory of furnishings that were in the executive mansion. So renovating of the White House had really begun with the Hardings and then was continued by Grace Coolidge. And then Lou picked that up. But Lou also understood that there was way more to what was in the White House and that it had an incredible historical significance. So Lou, out of her own money, hired a family friend, Dare Stark McMullen, to photograph and research the provenance of everything in the White House. And I do mean everything. I'm not talking about just sofas and chairs and bureaus in the family quarters. I'm talking about every urn, every painting, every candlestick. And Lou had documented just a very, very detailed publication, which had been her very strong hope to have published. Unfortunately, when the Hoovers got turned out of the White House and with the Depression lingering as many years as it did, anything associated with the Hoover name really had problems being accepted by publishers. And that document, of which my understanding is there are only 2 copies of it, one it was at the White House and one is at the Hoover Library, but it is quite something. Lou was also a very, very strong promoter of the arts. Now, there had always been arts and culture in the White House. There was a gentleman from the Steinway Piano Company who helped to organize and put together the calendars of artistic events or the more musical events. And Lou, toward the end of her tenure in the White House, really began to push for more Americans to perform in the White House rather than have a predominance of European artists. So again, she was looking for ways to showcase American talent, American gifts, and American talent. Probably the one thing that Lou, and again, her whole concept of doing things in private, not being willing to really publicize anything that she did, but Lou was privately, of her own funding, helping people who were harmed and hurt by the Depression. She had a network of women all across the country who she could depend upon for their discretion. And I can tell you from having researched both Lou's life and the First Lady Frances Cleveland's life, that it is really common for First Ladies to get letters from Americans letting them know about the hardships that they are experiencing and asking for some kind of help. Sometimes it's something very simple, well, not simple, but straightforward, such as, could you arrange for my husband or for me to get the postmaster job in our community? Sometimes it's a little more direct in asking for funding. Lou would look at these letters, and ones that struck her as being genuine and worthy of follow-up, she would contact her connections in that community and ask for them to come check these people out. And if it was understood, if it was determined that they could benefit from, sometimes it was nothing more than $15 or $20, but it was out of Lou's private money, and she made sure that it was sent anonymously, and then she would have her connections follow up. Lou also privately funded tuitions for minority students, for an African-American woman who attended Hampton Institute, for an Hispanic woman who wanted to study and become a beautician. And in the one case, the Hispanic woman did know who her benefactress was. But in the case of the African-American woman in Hampton Institute in Virginia, we're pretty sure that that person never knew who had funded her education. And again, these are things which none of us probably knows the extent of it. When Lou passed away in 1944 and her family were going through her desk, they found uncashed checks from people who had known that she had sent them some money and she had never cashed them. She was just an incredibly generous and compassionate woman. But where she drew the line, and both she and Bert were very much aligned in this thinking, they really did not think that the state should be involved in a lot of large-scale welfare. Of course, given what happened in the Depression and people's perceptions, that viewpoint wasn't a popular one toward the end of the Hoover administration, and it still isn't a popular one today. But Lou believed that we needed to encourage and support those who would help others on a private one-to-one basis, and she certainly lived what she believed. So in her post-White House years, Lou, I should say that even though Lou, okay, so let me back up. The Daisy Lowe set it up so that, and this was a really brilliant move on her part, so that the First Lady of the land would agree to be the honorary president of the Girl Scouts of America. So Lou, from 1929 to 1933, had resigned her board position and had served in her capacity as the honorary president of the Scouts. But she continued to have correspondence with the directors to oversee the hiring of a new director, to help with the finances, to try to get the organization to continue on a strategic 5-year plan, to have it on a solid financial footing. And she resumed her activities in the Scouts, first by serving on the board after 1933, and then again becoming president of the Scouts from 1935 to 1937. She spent most of her time in a home that she had built herself. She was more or less the architect, working with a faculty member at Stanford University. And Bert spent most of his time at a suite of at an apartment that the couple had at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. And they had a little bit of a transcontinental relationship, but Lou enjoyed her home and the home that she had built, and really became a very integral part of the Stanford community. She had a lot of the women students to her home over the years for tea. She was there to encourage and support them in their careers and in developing their own sense of independence. And as I mentioned earlier, she loved and was very, very committed to music. And I'll have to just put a kind of interesting aside here. When Lou was at the Los Angeles Normal School, she oftentimes was number 1 or number 2 in her class. And her lowest grade was her music grade. And she made 80s in music. And she has a note in her diary about how the music professor had assured her that that low grade was not going to affect her standing in the class. So I found it interesting that she struggled in her music classes, but she was just absolutely a devoted aficionado, if you will, of music and musical performances, a supporter of the arts, both in terms of being an attendee at concerts, as well as, again, that private philanthropy. She helped to support a couple of artists. One was a harpist, another was a violinist. And so she realized that Stanford, or the community of Palo Alto, did not have its own musical series. Mills College, that was in Oakland, which was a women's college, and Lou was a member of the board of trustees there, did have that type of artistic music series. And people from Stanford were traveling to Oakland, and we're talking about back in the 30s. We're not talking about just being able to hop a BART and get over there. So she, with a friend of hers, Mrs. Coolidge, not the relationship to Grace Coolidge, the First Lady, helped to fund a musical series and get that program started at Stanford. I should add that it wasn't necessarily straightforward. If you ever have an opportunity, some of Lou's letters, perhaps the library will find a couple of those letters and share them in one of the blogs. But her letters to encourage people to donate to get it started are just absolutely masterful pieces of friendly arm twisting and cajoling, and almost just this sort of underlying thought of not exactly making you feel guilty if you don't, but making you a little ashamed of yourself if you don't. Send her some money to get this started. She did run into a little bit of issue with the president of Stanford, who took the rather administrative view of not knowing where the organization was going to fit within the larger scale of Stanford. But Lou, being Lou, did not let that rest, and she worked through that. Friends of Music ultimately led to the establishment of the School of Music at Stanford University. So it wasn't just beginning with a group of artists to have an annual concert series, but it moved into something much larger and more permanent. People may also not know that Lou was very instrumental in the creation of a physical therapy program at Stanford University. She worked with a friend of hers who was a woman physician, who was the physician to the women at Stanford on the campus. And her friend, Lou's friend, and I apologize, I didn't write the name down and it's eluding me right now, worked with her. It told her that she thought that kind of program would be very beneficial on the campus. And indeed, Lou worked behind the scenes to make that happen. Lou also became very active with the Salvation Army in Palo Alto, and after World War II broke out, she became a very engaged fundraiser, helped to organize a clothing drive that was a multi-state effort to gather clothing and then to ship it to London, which was experiencing such heavy bombing once as the war spread throughout that continent. And as I mentioned earlier, Lou was a trustee for Mills, but also for Whittier College. You may recall my saying that she had spent many years in Whittier as a teenager. She also received multiple honorary doctorates through her life, and also was a trustee for some other organizations. So with that, Jerry, I think we're ready for some questions.
Well, great presentation, Annette. Just terrific on there. We do have some questions on there, and I would also encourage listeners, if you got questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A, and we'll go ahead and read them off and have Annette answer them. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with the first one, and it's from Patricia Scott, and she goes, "Do you think Lou Hoover is not as well known as other first ladies because she died so young? And President Hoover lived a long life and prevented access to her papers for many years after her death." What's your thoughts on that?
I would agree with that, Patricia. That's pretty much my take on it as well. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, and it's very unfortunate. The other reason why I think she's not as well known is her successor, Eleanor Roosevelt, was in office as First Lady for 12 or 13 years. The Roosevelts came in 1933. Franklin Roosevelt passed in April of 45. So, right, 12 years. And Eleanor Roosevelt, to your point, was a formidable independent woman, although I would definitely make the case that some of that, of course, was Mrs. Roosevelt's personality, but it was also because Lou had paved a way for that independence that I don't think Lou gets her due for. But also, unlike Lou, who unfortunately did pass away at a young age, Eleanor Roosevelt lived a very long life. And Eleanor Roosevelt also was more agreeable to the use of publicity and image making, whereas, as I've mentioned a couple times this evening, Lou just cherished her privacy.
Very good, thank you. Jan asked, did Lou visit Iowa after her success on there?
Well, that's a great question, Jerry, because I know that you're in the process of renovating the Hoover birthplace. And so let me just share about that a little bit. So Lou's mother passed away during the presidential campaign in 1928. And after the funeral and after Lou had gotten her son, Herbert Jr. settled in his year at Stanford, Lou decided to hop in the family Cadillac, take her father with her, and also her nephew Dell, her sister's son, and drive all the way across the country back to Washington, D.C. Okay, so y'all remember I just said that the late 1930s about San Francisco to Oakland. Well, just remember, no interstates. So we're talking about maybe being able to average 35, 40 miles an hour in terms of distance traveled in any given per hour per day. So one of the things that Lou made a very definitive point of doing was stopping in West Branch. And Jerry, I feel so much like I'm right there with you. I almost said here in West Branch to visit with Bert's family, to see about the possibility of purchasing his birthplace. And so, yes, she did visit Iowa, and not just for campaign reasons, but also because she became really the catalyst for what is now known as the Herbert Hoover Foundation.
Yeah, you're actually exactly right. And, it's an interesting story because she basically took upon renovation of the birthplace cottage herself. And then once she got it set up, then, she asked if there'd be a local group that could take it over. And again, true to the Hoover belief of volunteerism. And what they invited 30 people to meet on March 22nd, or March 23rd rather, of 1939 to kind of incorporate and put that group together. And actually a day earlier, there were 31, which is ironic. 31 always seems to pop up with Herbert Hoover, 31st president, so forth. But anyway, so yes, on March 22nd, 82 years ago, it was the Birthplace Society, which is the forerunner of the foundation, was founded. So it's a great story on there, and you're seeing our social media tweets on it and Facebook posts. It's quite a story, and so we'll have a lot on that on Mondays throughout the day. So we also got a question from Leroy, and of course he says, fascinating presentation, thank you. Did Lou Hoover have any particular models for women's suffrage or expressions of her own to support women's suffrage?
That's a good question, and you're going to have to give me a second, Leroy, to just kind of think about it. I guess off the top of my head, my initial reaction is not that I can really think of. I do know that Lou had a couple of very close friends who were very, very strong in the suffrage movement. Both of those friends, as a matter of fact, had been active in the suffrage movement in Great Britain and had gotten arrested. And Bert had bailed them out of jail and kind of hoped they go back to the United States, quick getting arrested. But Lou is very oddly quiet about suffrage. It's almost, and this is what I say as a kind of an independent scholar, we've got to be really careful about putting our 21st century lenses on what the world was like in 1910, 1920. So for whatever reasons, I will tell you that she wrote a very interesting composition as a schoolgirl in which she said that women were classified in the same category as jailbirds and denied the right to vote. So she definitely believed from a young age that women should have that. but for whatever reasons, whether it was because of Bert's political career, the social circles that she herself was involved in, she just didn't push that particular agenda. She moved in other directions, looked for other ways to empower women outside of the political sphere, although she certainly had no problem with any women in the political sphere. In fact, one of her close friends was the daughter of William Jennings Bryan, Ruth Bryan Owen, who became a member of Congress. So yeah, no negative attitudes, just not an activist in that particular area.
Mm-hmm. So, and of course, our lead archivist, Craig Wright, which you know very well, having research here at the library. Craig has put a comment into, I think it might have been to reference somebody asking about Lou's papers and maybe the visibility, but Craig writes, he says, Lou's papers were not open to the public for research until 1985. So on there, so there hasn't been an awful lot of time, really. It's just the last 35 years or so that people have been able to go in and learn about Lou Henry Hoover.
That's right.
Yeah. Got a question too. I don't know if you know the answer. Did the Henry family, Lou's obviously family, did they know the Nixon family at all in Whittier, California?
Okay.
Their paths cross?
Right. That's a really interesting question. From what I'm able to, if they did, it wasn't anything that Lou wrote about, but it's kind of important to realize that even though we kind of associate Lou with Whittier, that her family moved to Monterey, California in 92 maybe. So, and then they had a acreage in Monterey, and that's where they spent the balance of their lives. So if there were any connections, the answer to that would be no. I did, to that point, take a look to see if Lou might have been a trustee when Richard Nixon attended Whittier College, but she would have, I don't believe she was a trustee at that time. But somebody may correct me on that.
Okay. Well, Maria writes, the Hoover family seemed to be very balanced despite so many travels and being in the White House. What kind of mother was Lou Henry Hoover?
She was the most interesting mother ever, and they were balanced. I think if anybody kind of looked at the way she mothered her sons and then saw how well they turned out, they would not want to pass that information on. So Lou kind of left them with nannies when they were younger. And then when they were older, she was traveling so much that she had other people running the house for her. And the way that she would mother her sons was she would send letters and telegrams to the women who were running the household, telling them what they were supposed to do with each of the boys. And she would send her sons letters telling them what she expected of them. Now, I will say that when she and her sons were finally able to leave Europe and World War I, it's the way that I read the correspondence, she really did not want to come back to Europe. She wanted to stay with the boys. Herbert Jr. was having some health problems. She wanted to be there for him. She was ready to settle down, but Herbert kept begging her to come back. And so she finally did start doing this transatlantic crossing. And so what ended up happening while she was in Europe was that Herbert was staying with the Burge Clark family, and that was, by the way, the man who was the co-architect with Lou's house in Palo Alto. And then Alan, the younger son, was staying with her parents in Monterey. So when the boys got older, she really wanted to spend more time with them. I think because they were becoming young adults, she could be more interactive with them. So there was a lot of mothering from a distance, and yet you can see in the correspondence, just as the questioner has indicated, there was a lot of love and a lot of commitment, and a sense that in spite of their parents not being physically present all the time, that they were cared for and they were cared about.
Great, thank you. Another question we have from Christian is, what kind of impact was Lou's friendship with Mary Box Walcott?
Well, you've got one on, you're going to have to help me there. She was the wife of the Smithsonian director? Am I, Craig, are you going to help me out on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. If somebody had the question, feel free to chime in with more detail, and I'll be sure and pull it up right away.
Okay, I believe that Mary Box Walcott may have been a fellow geologist, and I can't remember if she was actually employed by the Smithsonian or her husband was employed by the Smithsonian. I do know that Lou and Ms. Walcott went to the National Quaker meeting. I believe it was held in Philadelphia during one of the years in which the Hoovers were in the White House. And there appeared to be a very good, close friendship, both a combination of personal friendship and professional friendship. And
Okay,
if I'm incorrect about her, please let me know.
Okay, very good, very good. So, well, Carol Ann writes, she goes, I teach Iowa history. Do you have any book titles that you believe would be appropriate for my students? Average reading level of 4th grade. And I would presume it's about Lou Henry Hoover.
If there is a youth bio out, I have not seen it. And the ones that are available that are not written at the 4th grade level. So there's an opportunity.
Great. Well, Ruthie Tiffin writes, and Ruthie's a good friend of the former resident here at West Branch, and she's done a lot of great things here with the foundation. And Ruthie writes, have you written a book about Lou's life? And if not, what book would you recommend?
I have written a book about Lou's life, and for a lot of the reasons that we don't know about her, we've got publishers that seem to be a little squirrely about publishing about her. So it is with a publisher right now being looked at, and my fingers are crossed. And so yes, it's there, and I very much would like to see it see the light of day. So just keep that in mind.
Well, I would say on this, Annette, if you need some lobbying, we've got about 115 people on this thing that would probably be glad to chime in on that. So
stay tuned. You may be hearing from me through.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm sure they will help out. So let's see. Christian Lutz writes, and this must have been about Mary Alcott. Her husband was secretary of the Smithsonian.
Okay, so I was right, and that is who it is. So,
okay.
So, yes, sir, my statement's on her stand.
And of course, the next time you come to West Branch, and Craig Wright wrote back in too, he says, you know, he hasn't read the papers, but we have 6 fat folders of correspondence between Lou and Ms. Walcott. So anyway, so Delene writes, did Lou have a sense of humor?
Yes. She was just a really, really delightful, extroverted woman. And again, not to keep belaboring the point, but again, that's another sad part of her not wanting to let somebody help mold her public image, because she had a delightful sense of humor, and she was such a charming woman, and everybody loved her. Women loved her, men loved her. She made friends easily, way more of an extrovert and more of a people person than her husband was. And probably those people skills were her people skills were probably his biggest asset in the political arena. So yes, absolutely.
Well, I remember when we had an exhibit a few years ago, and one of the we actually had, it was a Cadillac that had been given to the Hoovers. And Lou wrote a note, I think, to the president of Cadillac at the time, thanking him, and was very humorous. I mean, with talking about, you know, I've got a new stallion now in my, in my stables and so forth like that. It was just a real wry sense of humor on that you could just, be a person that you would really enjoy meeting and knowing.
Absolutely, yes, and you know, you're right. That kind of humor, that wryness, that's what a great writer she was too, because she conveyed that in her writing. It wasn't just in the one-on-one, but it was also, she could write that way and really use writing skills to convey that humor and that laughter.
Okay, great. Well, and Christian writes, he says he's waiting for normalcy so I can visit the library, as Lou Henry Hoover was my sixth cousin 3 times removed. So we have relatives, another branch of relatives on here. So obviously and that's wonderful on that. So, and of course, Lynn Smith, who you know very, very well here, works at the library, and she goes, great presentation, Annette. Just a comment. She said Lou made a commencement address, maybe it was Whittier, I can't recall, that she encouraged women to use the new power of voting wisely and be an educated voter on that.
Thank you. Yes.
Yep. So Beverly asked, and of course, I think you might have answered this, but did Lou ever return to Waterloo as an adult? I mean, she came back with her father. Was there any other time that we know of on that?
Yeah, you know, a couple of years ago when the city of Waterloo was looking to put a statue of Lou up, I know I had had some communication with the officials there, and I don't know that we were ever really able to pinpoint her returns, potential returns as an adult. So unfortunately, we probably need to do a little more homework and see maybe if there's something in an old newspaper or something that might give us a clue, but we can't tell, we don't know.
Uh-huh. Well, I know the city of Waterloo is very proud of Lou Henry Hoover, and they have a beautiful statue up there on there. And I think it's one of the only places that actually has a elementary school named after Lou Henry Hoover on there, which is ironically, or not ironically, it's situated right next to Herbert Hoover Middle School. So, so anyway, Danielle writes, was Lou someone who held religious faith? Did she ever speak of it publicly?
Excellent question. She was deeply religious. In fact, Herbert even alluded to Lou's depth of faith. But again, this was one of those components that it was a very private thing with her. Her belief about faith was that you lived it out. And again, that's where that spirit of generosity, that desire to help people, that really flowed from this deep-seated faith. Her strong commitment in her later years to the Salvation Army, which I hope all of our listeners know that is a Christian organization. That was a part of her underlying religious ethos. Yes.
Okay. And Jan Myers has a couple questions. I'm going to combine them together so you could answer them. But she said, did Lou ever take any of the brunt of the Depression? And also, too, did she ever retain international friendships from her overseas travels?
Okay, so I'm not sure what the first part of the question is. Let me go back to that. Yes, she retained quite a number of overseas friendships for a number of years. And those overseas friendships, by the way, weren't just limited to Europe. She still had some correspondence with people in Asia that she had gotten, Australia, that she had gotten to know in the very early 1900s. She was a prolific correspondent, just an absolutely outstanding letter writer. She could go for long periods of time doing not writing and getting pestered by people. Why haven't we heard from you? And then all of a sudden there'd just be this huge flurry of correspondence. In terms of, was there a financial brunt? If you read Lou's correspondence, she will say that they took a hit from the family. She managed the family finances, and she, wrote her sons, don't expect your allowance for the coming year, or don't expect your allowance to be as high as it's been. And I'm not sure your dad's going to be able to afford an assistant. But in all honesty, Bert had been very successful in his careers, and the money had been extremely well managed. And they may have had to cut back a little bit, but absolutely not in any of the ways that it seriously cut into their lifestyle.
Okay, great. So, and of course, Archivist Craig Wright, Craig chimes in too. He says he doesn't remember the year, but Lou did visit Waterloo as an adult. So, she says he says they do have a full photo album given to her during the visit. So again, that's something that somebody, next time, Annette, you're to the library, you can take a look at. And obviously, regular visitors, you would have to register as a researcher, but then once you do that, I'm sure that the archivist would be glad to share that with you too. So we're getting down to time. We got about time for maybe one more question. Karen asks, says, was Lou close with her sister?
Yes, the two of them were very, very close. Just very, very quickly, her sister was at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked in 1941 and was stranded there until 1943 when they were finally able to come back. So yes, they were very, very close.
Okay, great. And we've got one question from Ed Daring, and Ed goes, where was Lou originally buried? He goes, I assume it wasn't in West Branch since she passed away 20 years before Herbert did.
Right. I believe she was probably buried on the Stanford University campus. Maybe Craig will chime in on that if I've missed that one.
I think that is correct. In fact, one of the things that research I checked into when I took this job was I always had the question is, so when did Lou come to West Branch? And the answer was actually just about a week after Herbert was buried. They moved her here on that. So anyway, well, that's all the time that we have for questions. We got some multitudes of questions, and it was really great to have you, Annette. Once we get this pandemic out of the way, we'll look forward to getting you back here in West Branch on the Hoover campus in person on that. And love to have you come back and visit us and speak.
I would love to do that, Jerry, and I'm looking forward to that. So we're all gonna keep our fingers crossed that life's gonna return to the pre-COVID normal as soon as possible and make it happen.
Oh, very good. Well, again, thank you, Annette, and thanks to everybody. That's all the time we got for questions now. And again, Annette had just an excellent presentation. I'd also like to thank the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum, the Herbert Hoover National Historic Site, and all of the public libraries who helped make tonight's program a great success. And I encourage you to come visit the Hoover campus and enjoy a walk around the park and explore the historic buildings now that the temperatures are coming back up here in Eastern Iowa on that. For now, of course, the Presidential Library still remains closed to the public, but the staff is working behind the scenes for a gradual reopening. The National Historic Site grounds and historic buildings are now open to the public. However, the visitor center remains closed for the time being, although rumor has it it's going to open pretty soon, as well as the Friends Meeting House and the Prairie Trails, as they are under construction as crews work on a flood mitigation project along the creek. The Birthplace Cottage, Blacksmith Shop, Schoolhouse, and Gravesite are open daily until 5 p.m. Now, the Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is here daily and ready to assist you with your membership needs or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus. Remember, our 82nd birth anniversary is Monday, and we'd appreciate your support of programs like this one with a thoughtful gift to help celebrate Founders Day on the 22nd. And of course, don't forget to register for a special program next Monday, March 29th at noon. It's called Lou Henry Hoover, A Life of Adventure. And we'll have Leslie Hoover-Laval and Hoover archivist Spencer Howard with us, and they'll pick up the story of Lou's early life and the many adventures she had. Registration is free and open now on our website. On behalf of all of us here at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus. Have a great evening.